numbers are growing every day. With more than 80% of schools in Gaza damaged or destroyed, the expert used the term scholasticide, a term that was first coined by Professor Carmen, and it refers to the systematic obliteration of education through the arrest, detention, or killing of teachers, students, and staff, and the destruction of educational infrastructure. This systematic destruction of the Palestinian educational system is at the core of the settler colonial logic of elimination. But this systematic destruction is not new. It started with the Nakba. Back then, thousands of Palestinian books, libraries, archives, photographs, cultural artifacts, and cultural property were looted, destroyed, or damaged by the Zionist militia. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish legal scholar who coined the term genocide, believed that genocide is basically an effort to undermine the fundamental basis of the social order. Key to this effort is the assault on the cultures of national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups. The Palestinian educational and academic community is subject to attacks in all the territories under the control of Israel. According to Law for Palestine, between January 1, 2019 and October 17, 2022, Israel arrested 214 Palestinian students in the West Bank. According to the Right to Education campaign, currently there are at least 140 students from Birzeit University detained in Israeli prisons and detention facilities, half of them under administrative detention. Since October 7th, 70 members of Birzeit University community were detained, including 4 staff members. Most academic institutions in the West Bank have shifted to online teaching to avoid campus invasions by the Israeli army and to prevent the harassment, arrest, or even killing of students and staff by Israeli soldiers and violent settlers. Moving to Israel, before I address the harassment campaign against Professor Shalhoub and what it signifies, I would like to mention that other faculty members have been harassed for speaking up against the war, including Jewish faculty. For example, Professor Regev Natanzon was forced to take an unpaid leave due to students' pressure for signing a petition asking President Biden to stop sending offensive weapons to Israel. I also want to provide some data on the harassment of Palestinian students studying at Israeli universities. According to Adala, between October 7th and October 23rd, the organization documented over 100 reports from students who faced repression and disciplinary proceedings for their activity on social media. These students faced suspension or even expulsion. 52 students faced suspension prior to a hearing, 8 were expelled without a hearing, and 3 were expelled from their dorms without prior notice or a hearing. The Minister of Education, Yoav Kish, publicly endorsed these disciplinary actions. He also issued a letter asking universities to suspend or expel individuals who, in his view, supported terrorism. According to testimonies of students, disciplinary hearings turned into McCarthyist interrogations, focusing on the students' political opinions without a direct relationship to the content of what they published. As for the case of Professor Shalhoub, the harassment campaign against her did not start with the decision to suspend her from the Hebrew University or the decision to detain her and interrogate her for incitement. This campaign started months ago after she signed and circulated a petition accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. As a response, the Hebrew University published an official letter accusing her of incitement and sedition. As for her suspension, the Hebrew University made it clear that it is proud of being a Zionist institution and that Professor Shalhoub was asked repeatedly in the past to find another academic home that suits her position. So to frame this primarily as an academic freedom issue is simply misleading. First of all, when they decided to publicly accuse her of incitement and sedition, they prepared the ground for her harassment by the authorities. They put her life in danger too, given the rising violence of extreme right-wing activists against Palestinians. But most importantly, when academic institutions join the efforts of the state in silencing dissent in the face of the gross violations of international law and basic morality, like the ones that we are witnessing in Gaza, this amounts at least to immoral complicity in these atrocities. The Commission of International Crimes is made possible through aggressive attempts to silence dissent. For sure, Israeli universities were willing to tolerate scholarship on settler colonialism or other scholarship highly critical of Israel and Zionism, as long as this critique remained confined to academic debates on the margin. In fact, they benefited from this scholarship to boost their reputation as bastions of academic freedom, while they were collaborating with security forces in different ways. But when such scholarship started to make waves in international institutions, things have changed dramatically. It is no longer a small group of Palestinian and anti-Zionist scholars and few NGOs that use the settler colonial paradigm or the apartheid framework or the concept of slow genocide. We have UN reports charging apartheid, a UN rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, using the settler colonial paradigm to underpin the apartheid framework. The International Court of Justice issued provisional measures in the case brought by South Africa, which means that accusations of genocide are plausible. We have the advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice on the legality of the Israeli occupation in its entirety. More than 50 states participated in the hearing. The vast majority of them argued that the occupation as a whole is illegal and not just certain practices. Many states and organizations took the view that Israel practices in the territories occupied in 1967 amount to apartheid. Others saw the occupation as a continuation of the Nakba. The university's explicit alignment with Zionism is a direct response to these political changes. It means that the university is actively engaged in producing certain narratives that normalize the horrific violence in Gaza, with the aim of shielding Israel from accountability, while at the same time waging attacks on those who produce counter-narratives that have been endorsed by international institutions. It is no coincidence that they targeted Nadira, a world-renowned scholar. They wanted to send a clear message to all Palestinian faculty members and students. If we can go after someone like Nadira, imagine what will happen if we go after you. This amounts to epistemic violence against Palestinian scholars and students and those who are committed to justice. For us, Palestinians, the only thing that the Zionist project brought upon us is ethnic cleansing in 1948, renewed threat of a new Nakba, land disposition, attacks on our collective identity, attempts to erase our history in our homeland, and being ruled by a regime that is based on racial supremacy. But we will not be stripped of our humanity. We will continue to advocate for justice, liberation, decolonization, and freedom to our people, even when the Israeli mainstream propaganda media accuse us of incitement for defending the dignity and the basic human rights of our people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sonia. We'll go to Osama next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you to al-Carmel. Thank you, Omar. And thank you to Security in Context. I mean, I guess I'll just follow up on what Sonia was saying. I mean, we all know that Western leaders have publicly supported Israel's genocide against the Palestinians in the name of self-defense. And we all know that across the liberal West, to say nothing, as Sonia was saying, in Israel itself, there's an extraordinary dehumanization and persecution of Palestinians that's tied directly to their decontextualization. We all know that geopolitics is brutal and unsentimental, but what's been staggering to me is how quickly every reputable academic institution in the West, across the West, virtually every academic institution, including my own here at UC Berkeley, have abandoned critical thought when it was needed most. They almost all, every institution that I'm aware of, lined up in lockstep after October 7th to both mourn the Israeli victims of violence and at the same time to condemn Palestinian violence, but have since then refused, as Sonia was alluding to mourn the dispossessed, brutalized, disinherited, oppressed Palestinians who've been subjected to an obvious genocide for over 7 months, as well as, of course, the decades of colonialism before October 7th. These universities and these university leaders, as well as cultural leaders, let alone politicians, have said absolutely nothing, not a word, as far as I'm aware. And correct me if I'm wrong, anyone here, they've said not a single word about the destruction of every single university Palestinian university in Gaza, as Sonia also mentioned, nor the massacre of Palestinian academics, nor of educators, nor of students, nor the destruction of libraries and archives, and nor, as again Sonia mentioned, the scandalous persecution of our great colleague Professor Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian. The American Historical Association, to which I belong, immediately, for example, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but has said absolutely nothing about the Israeli genocide in Gaza, despite the destruction of universities, archives, libraries, and so on. Not a word, not a single word. All this, to me, puts into perspective the dictum of the great sort of anti-colonial scholar Frantz Fanon in his Wretched of the Earth, when he said, famously said that objectivity is always directed at the native. I used to think that Fanon simply meant and referred to how knowledge was orientalized, how racism frames the native and has always framed the natives as inferior, as dispensable, as irrelevant, as outside of history. But now I realize what he also meant is that how many of our colleagues want to believe that they're more objective, and I mean colleagues across the country and across the liberal West, want to believe that they're more objective, that they're less divisive than us, because they consider themselves to be neutral above the fray of politics and history, and thus they allow themselves to remain silent even as a genocide unfolds before our eyes. History for them has to be in the past before it can be accurately judged. And to put it differently, it seems to be, at least to me, the case that only when Palestinian victims are victims in the past can Western academia safely commemorate them and summon the moral, ethical, and intellectual courage to condemn their persecution, but not, crucially, at the moment of their actual persecution. In sum, it seems to me that only when the natives are dead does Western academia rush in to dominate, if not monopolize, their mourning. And it's always, it seems to me, been like this. To say this is simply to underscore what seems to me a basic Western truth about Western academia. It's not there to overturn the unequal status quo, but merely to polish its sharpest edges. On the one hand, there is, without question, there remains a certain limited and I think increasingly restricted space of academic freedom and critical thought in fields, mostly in the humanities, to think about Palestine, and many of us are in Western academia. And at the same time, there is a far greater, frankly, investment in neoliberalism, in the free market, and in the military industrial and technological complex that actually is involved in making the very bombs that we are actually criticizing the dropping of in Palestine. Yet the Palestine question, unlike many others, is not about the past, but obviously it's about the present and future. It's the colonialism of the present that puts to test the meaning of the vast culture of Western official academic commemoration of past evils, of slavery, of the Holocaust, of anti-indigenous genocides that are so routinely commemorated in Western academia. But without talking about Palestine, the question is, what is the value of these other commemorations? Because it's precisely in the moment of genocide, in the moment of violence, in the moment of persecution, in the moment of dehistoricization and decontextualization, that the true meaning of these other commemorations, it seems to me, comes into full view. And I could say a lot more. I used to think it's only about the careerism of others and their fear about their careers, but it's not just that. There's something more insidious, I think, at work, which is to say, there's a long-standing tradition in Western academia that is and has always been deeply hostile to anti-colonial resistance and has consistently demonized anti-colonial movements throughout the world and throughout history. And I recall here the anthropologist Inga Clendenning, who once described historians, my profession, as being the camp followers of the imperialists. And she was referring to the way historians used to narrate the conquest of the New World. And what she says about them, I think, applies to so many historians today working on the contemporary world. And the second problem is the massive shift that occurred after World War II, where the Western academia took the lead in a sense in conflating the struggle against anti-Semitism with the celebration of the State of Israel, so that today, decades later, you still see this logic, which is to say that there's a conflation, a consistent conflation of criticizing Israel with anti-Semitism, a denial of Palestinian history, a denial of Palestinian humanity, a denial of Palestinian scholarship, and a conflation of Palestinian solidarity work by students and faculty and staff of all faiths with anti-Semitism, so that it allows then universities to come out and condemn October 7th, but not condemn what came before October 7th, nor the genocide that has come after October 7th, precisely because the conflation that's ongoing all the time is that solidarity on behalf of Palestine and Palestinians is in fact anti-Semitism. This is the discourse that is repeated time and again at virtually every level, at the US government level, at institutional levels, and of course in the New York Times and other mainstream Western media outlets. It's this kind of extraordinary conflation of Israel with a fight against anti-Semitism that is tied to a denial of Palestinians and their history, and the fact that peoples of all faiths, including, as Sonia mentioned, Jewish academics who are anti-Zionist with anti-Semitism. In other words, what there is up until now is this refusal to engage with history, a refusal to engage with the fact that there is a growing cultural shift, a generational shift taking place across the world that we see right now at places like UC Berkeley, at Columbia, at NYU, at Vanderbilt, and many different institutions across this country, and I'm sure in Europe as well as in the third world and the global south. There's a whole generation of younger people, of students, who refuse to buy this narrative that standing in solidarity with Palestinians is anti-Semitism. In fact, they unmask this discourse and this rhetoric for the racism and the racial hierarchy that it contains. And so we're, I think, at a turning point. The only question is, what is going to be left of Gaza? What is going to be left of Palestine and the Palestinians before this generational shift shows and has political, epistemic, intellectual, ethical, and moral effects. So I hope, I'm confident, of course, the Palestinians are not going to disappear. I know they're not going to disappear, but we're at this turning point, and there's a horror unfolding. I honestly wish more of my colleagues across this country and across the West would speak out for justice and against the persecution of their own students, as well as, of course, the persecution of the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Osama. And as with Sonia, lots of points to think about and maybe come back to. Thank you for those attending. I just want to remind you that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. And after this first round, we can possibly start incorporating them. But with that, I'll go next to Alex.
Thank you, Omar. And thank you, Sonia and Osama, for your comments. I will be building a little bit on where Osama left off. I want to offer my support and solidarity to students and scholars facing elimination, termination, suspension, and sanctions due to their advocacy for Palestinian freedom, for their criticism of Zionism, for their opposition to occupation, for their condemnation of genocide. It feels a bit like a distraction to think about the status of academic repression in the United States today during a live stream genocide, because no group of scholars face the dangers of the present moment more than students, scholars, and academic staff in Gaza. And yet we know that through its actions in the United Nations, its military aid, and its silencing of dissent, the US is complicit in this genocide, and universities in the United States, like their counterparts in Israel, produce the knowledge and expertise to justify settler colonialism. So to focus on the US is in no way to take attention away from what is happening in Gaza, nor should it, and across Palestine. But it is to show how challenges to US and Israeli hegemony are being mounted in US academies. We are living through a realignment in solidarity movements, as well as new iterations of repression and fascism. Across Europe and the United States, scholars who criticize the ongoing genocide, or who criticize Zionism, or who support Palestinian freedom have been doxxed, suspended, and fired. Almost every university administration, as Osama says, in the United States has released statements condemning Hamas, but these same institutions have remained silent about the assault on Gaza's higher education infrastructure, about the genocide in general, and about attacks on their own faculty and students by Zionist organizations. Taken together, the attack on Palestinian knowledge production and solidarity movements represents an appalling complicity with genocide and a frontal attack on all knowledge production that doesn't serve the interests of war. Moreover, what has been especially pernicious in the present has been the weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism to silence dissent, analysis, and solidarity. For decades now, Zionist organizations in the US have been successful at appropriating the language of civil rights and the civil rights movement to argue that Jewish safety, imagined as always and already aligned to Israel, should be the primary interest of the university. Palestinian, Muslim, Jewish anti-Zionist students are not only deemed subjects undeserving of safety, but their very existence constitutes the production of unsafety for imagined Jewish students. Moreover, university censorship of the words like genocide, censorship of any analysis of what might constitute legitimate resistance, censorship of slogans like Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free, are especially anti-intellectual forms of silencing and dehumanization. Most campuses arguing for academic freedom go out of their way to offer protections for white nationalist speakers or even Zionist speakers who call for the outright ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Yet no similar protections are offered to Palestinian or Muslim students who merely demand an end to war and justice for all. In congressional hearings to investigate anti-Semitism on campuses, a topic that has reached the stage of moral panic due to the successful and scurrilous linking of Palestinian solidarity to anti-Semitism, university presidents have defamed their students, staff, and professors who dare to criticize what the UN terms a plausible genocide. Meanwhile, neoconservatives who espouse the anti-Semitic Great Replacement theory stand in judgment and condemnation of Palestine solidarity activists. To be clear, there is troubling anti-Semitism in Europe and America, but it is most likely to come from the white nationalist allies of Israel than from Palestine solidarity activists. I'm thinking here of a recent statement by President Joe Biden, who said that if it were not for Israel, Jewish Americans would have no safe place in the world. This, frankly, anti-Semitic argument elides centuries of Jewish cohabitation and safety in the Arab world, while projecting European and American anti-Semitism onto stateless Palestinians. It is important to recognize, I think, that the current attacks on US higher education have an historical arc that goes back to the ways that members of the New Left of the 1960s and 70s would come to embrace neoconservatism in the 1980s in their rejection of Black power and third world social student movements. Indeed, many of the most vociferous activists targeting Palestine solidarity activists today were themselves part of the left and socialist organizations in the 1960s. There's much already written on this rightward, on the history of this rightward trajectory of liberal intellectuals. And for now, I'll merely say that understanding how the New Left became neoconservative, how demands for redistributive justice in the 1960s became appropriated into the discourse of safety that we see today, reveals much about the authoritarian and fascist turn we're witnessing in politics in higher education. But I think this is probably an analysis that will come later after the present killing stops. Just to end, I want to add that I think it's important to understand that the moral panic of anti-Semitism in US higher education is a counterinsurgency in response to the success of a multiracial and multi-faith Palestinian solidarity movement. Zionist organizations and their allies are terrified that Palestinian, Muslim, Black, and Jewish non-Zionist students will join in solidarity and shatter the legitimacy of Zionism as the most legitimate narrative of justice and tolerance in the West. So while it is difficult to imagine the present moment as one containing any hope for a transformative future, there's a case to be made that young people are leading us to the new future. And there's a change taking place in the metropolitan public discourse through our campuses. Across the United States, the present generation of students are less attached to Israel than their parents and are more likely to participate in multiracial movement building and are highly skeptical of political and university leadership. These students are not facing the necropolitical consequences of war and elimination like their Palestinian counterparts, but their futures are attenuated by ascendant oligarchy, debt, and fascism. Within these contexts, Palestine has become a nexus for imagining different futures. It is a symbol of a new movement against militarism and securitization, a movement against starvation and genocide, and a movement against apartheid. Palestine has become a litmus test for thinking about collective forms of life that reject the partitioning of humanity, the partitioning of home, and the partitioning of justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. Next, I'll go to Mandy.
Thanks, Omar. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking from the UK, which of course is the country that was the first to repress Palestinians' right to self-determination. I want to make three main points to try and add to what the previous speakers have made. The role of academics is to speak and teach the truth and have the strength to do this, to try to support our students who are also doing this, and to listen to what our Palestinian colleagues are telling us. To pick up what Osama said about objectivity, objectivity is not the same as neutrality. In a court of law, for example, you would weigh up the evidence and then come to a conclusion. And I feel that this term objectivity is used in the same way as neutrality, and that's not correct in anything that we do. And the truth is that the British government is, like the American government, is complicit in Israel's genocide. And we need to say this loudly and clearly. We get the strength to do this through collective action, through our unions, through our organisations, and through our actions with each other every day in the classroom. If we're in tenured and privileged positions, we can challenge our institutions individually, but collectively we're stronger. Our Palestinian colleagues have been calling for a ceasefire, and so we need to focus on that. They've been calling Israel a settler colonial apartheid state for decades, and for over 15 years they've been calling for the support for boycott, divestment and sanctions. So I think these are a good guide to what we should be saying in Western academia. But in the UK we have a big problem. Maybe not as big as in the United States, but we still have a big problem because our government has always supported Zionism in Israel against Palestinian Arab self-determination. But like Alex, I want to emphasize that we are witnessing here at least a fundamental shift in public opinion, particularly amongst people under the age of 30. And this has accelerated since October the 7th. So the split between the political elite and the population is widening. And because of that split, we are seeing and experiencing unprecedented levels of censorship. And this has crossed the government and senior management in different sectors of British society, including the university sector. The students and academics are resisting this and promoting BDS across campuses through union motions, through direct action and through campaigning on campuses and on the streets. Like Alex, I want to highlight that those that are standing up and speaking the truth are actually having an impact now. But the government is cracking down on this in the UK in several ways. It's been weaponising the use of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. The UK was the first government to endorse that definition. And it forced British universities to adopt it. 75% of British universities adopted this, most of them done without consultation of staff or students. And while the IHRA is not law, it's being used in university disciplinary procedures. And this has had a chilling effect on people's willingness to speak out. The IHRA has also been used as a reference point for an investigation into anti-Semitism within the National Union of Students. And the report was released in November 2022, and it was really damning. There's also the anti-boycott bill that's going through Parliament at the moment that bans public institutions, including universities, from introducing boycotts or divestment. And this was passed by the UK House of Commons in January amid the bombardment of Gaza. Now, all of these measures are enabling pro-Israel groups such as UK Lawyers for Israel to further intimidate individuals and organisations who are critical of Israel and supportive of Palestinian rights. And the weaponisation of the charge of anti-Semitism has reached insane levels here, just as much as they are in the United States. But we are seeing a fundamental clash between the political elites and growing numbers of the British public. There's been 12 large demonstrations in London. The biggest was on the 11th of November when 800,000 people marched for a ceasefire and for Palestinian rights. So there's movement at the broader level. There's been growth in the number of Palestine solidarity groups. 3/4 of the British public have consistently supported a ceasefire in opinion polls, and there are many initiatives being taken across British civil and public life. Now, in the university sector, like Osama highlighted, we're seeing clashes between senior management and students and staff on this issue. And this has led to fundamental attacks on freedom of speech and academic freedom in UK universities. Now, we have seen student occupation demanding actions from university management, including the divestment of university funds from companies benefiting from the occupation. There's also the direct action activities of Palestine Action, directed at Israeli arms companies with bases in the UK. Now, we're seeing a lot of suspensions, investigations, arrests, and detentions for pro-Palestine actions amongst students and staff. Some have even been arrested and charged under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. In more than one case, students who have been arrested were actually reported to the police by their own university management, and overseas students have had their student visas revoked by the government. Now, these things are not often reported on because they could harm the legal cases that are being brought, but we know these are happening because of the amount of work that the European Legal Support Centre and the British Society for Middle East Studies are doing on this. And they're doing amazing work. So is the International Centre for Justice for Palestinians, which is a coalition of UK lawyers, along with organisations such as Friends of Birzeit University and the British Palestinian Committee. A lot of people are now lobbying for a change in UK policy and supporting students and staff who are also doing that in the universities. So all of this is to say that UK academics and students are active in support of Palestinian rights. They're campaigning for a ceasefire, for BDS, and for freedom of speech on campus. I really do feel that the tide is turning, but I also think that things will get much worse before they get better. We are seeing cases being taken against universities for their investment policies. We're seeing other examples of similar actions, direct action against university management, eroding freedom of speech. But there is an attempt now to try and make this more open. I know various colleagues that are tenured professors who are now taking actions against their universities for suppression of freedom of speech. And this is why we need to keep in terms of collective action, helping each other to keep speaking out. We need to speak out for our Palestinian colleagues. We need to defend their freedom of speech, and we need to defend their right to live in freedom and with dignity. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions in the discussion.
Thank you all so much. Really lots to think about, and I think we've put a lot of issues to discuss together. I had a couple questions about kind of thinking about moving forward, but before that, I wanted to see if anyone of the speakers had any follow-up comments that they wanted to jump in quickly and mention, or you can kind of incorporate that maybe as I ask some questions. So just thinking about moving forward, and I'm glad, Mandy, that you're telling us things are get better, but also that they might get worse before they get better, which is always ominous. But it's clear, and I think you guys have brought that out, that in many ways the supporters of Israel or apologists for Israel have lost the grassroots, have lost the kind of social movements, they've lost university campuses in many ways. Not, of course, in the way they describe it, as in hotbeds of anti-Semitism, but in the fact that there's no morally decent case to defend anything that Israel is doing. And that's why there's this increased resorting to repression, top down. So basically, you can't make the argument, you can't win the moral argument in any way. And now, of course, you can't defend anything that's happening. And so you're going to, initiate this campaign of repression, of laws. But how, I mean, this is just a very basic question. I mean, how much can they keep going back to that well of repression, of threatening with intimidation? I mean, where is that kind of trajectory going in your opinion? And whether it's on university campuses, I mean, we're seeing, as long as the violence continues against Palestinians, people are going to continue to demonstrate. So I'm just thinking kind of your thoughts about that. And the second, we're hit with so many disasters on a daily basis. One day we're rallying for the release of comrades and colleagues being arrested, and this repression taking place on campuses. And we all want to center kind of what's happening in Palestine. And I think, Mandy, you touched on that a little bit, but kind of moving forward, where do you see kind of the events going? How can we continue to center our opposition to the annihilation, to the genocide taking place in Palestine, while also keeping all of these different issues, really, that all these struggles, holding them together? We're at the same time trying to argue against and warn against a wider regional war, which Israel wants to drag the region into. So maybe some thoughts about these, and maybe where do you think, what should be done at this point? Where do you think we should continue doing? I know some of you touched on that already, but just to raise these issues and see if anyone has any comments about them. Maybe we'll go back to Sonia.
Okay. So basically, I'm wearing more than one hat now. I'm based in Spain, and Spain has been an exception in terms of, the ability to speak up against what's happening, and the political environment is different. So in my experience, it's a completely different context, although we have to be careful because things can change, and there is certain changes. But I want to go back to what we're doing in Mada, or in Palestine, and our struggle is different. We have more basic worries to worry about. Basically, you have an entire community that is under attack, and we are exhausted because, as you said, we have to be working on more than one front. And so before starting to think about what US universities can do, or other European universities can do, what we're worried about in Palestine now is how to organize the community, how to make sure that professors are not intimidated, how to make sure that Israel doesn't succeed in the plan of scaring everyone, of returning everyone to the days of the military rule that Palestinians were subjected to the first 2 decades of the establishment of Israel. So this is our first worry: organizing the community, empowering the community, making sure that people are not scared, looking for safety in numbers, and making sure that we're not lowering the threshold, making sure that our discourse, continues to be what we want it to be. And look, from the beginning, one of the things that we noticed when people started talking about what happened to Professor Shalhoub, the whole framing was academic freedom. We saw it as a completely different issue. So that's what we're going to keep doing: raise up the bar, organize the community, and make sure people are not scared. But there's one point that I want to talk about: the use of anti-Semitism to attack those who speak up for the Palestinian rights. One of the things that I think are missing is collaboration and coordination. I think it's about time that we think about a network of scholars and activists, transnational networks, because there are some, gains in some contexts that we don't know of. So it's about time we collaborate, we start learning from each other's experience, and we start supporting each other, and having even some sort of funding. because many times you need resources to be able to fend off certain attacks on the academic community, on artists, on activists. So for us, it's more the level of organization. Thank you.
Osama, any thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say they haven't just lost the ethical argument, as you said, Omar, the Zionists. They've lost the intellectual argument, the historical argument, which is precisely why they always bring it back to this terrain of accusing everybody, including Jewish anti-Zionists or non-Zionists, of anti-Semitism. I mean, that's the absurdity of where we are, both in the US and in the UK and in Germany, more than across the board in Europe, maybe with the exceptions, as Sonia was saying, in certain parts, but overwhelmingly this inability to articulate a case that actually deals honestly with history is I think indicative of where the scholarship has moved and where students and younger people who are accessing this knowledge are. And so there's a huge shift taking place. On the other hand, there's no question that the repression is going to continue because all the institutional, the political, the donor sort of power is overwhelmingly, I should say, on one side. When the U.S. government, from Joe Biden to the Christian Zionists to the AIPAC and the Israel lobby to pro-Israel donors to faculty of a certain generation in particular on campuses, who have been socialized into identifying with Israel. All these things, whether they're of any faith, all these people together, this is a formidable sort of a formidable reality that I think we have to, not pretend to not see. It's there. On the other hand, there is an extraordinary mobilization on the part of students and the youth. We're talking about Israel, and Zionism has lost an entire generation. So they can intimidate, they can brutalize, especially, in Israel, as Sonia is saying, they can physically repress and jail and persecute. And in the West, they can intimidate through various laws and all that stuff, but you can't silence an entire generation. So I really do think that there's shifts are taking place. They are trying to put their finger, in the holes in the dam that's cracking. The whole thing is crumbling. That's how I see it.
Thank you, Osama. Alex, any thoughts?
Yeah, just briefly, I don't know what the end game is of these of this current moment, at least in U.S. higher education. I teach my students in my course on the civil rights movement that students had a considerable amount of power as sort of the consumers, the customers of higher education, and that their power in the 60s and 50s was that when they protested, the universities listened to them because they were the economic engine of the university. Today, I'm not so sure that students have the same sorts of, for lack of a better term, consumer power as students. It seems to me, and I'm a little bit surprised, that at elite private institutions, that they're willing to suspend a significant portion of their student body and to lose that student tuition dollar, if you will. And it seems to me that the university is becoming much more a space of authoritarian rule than of, possibilities for civil disobedience. So I'm curious to watch that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the students will bring the universities down to and sort of make the universities comply with divestment, for example. But I'm not so sure. So that's something that I'm interested in. And I completely agree with Osama that these movements are building. They're not getting smaller, and that they are responses to a sort of, I think of a generation that has lived under the US war on terror. They are, at 20 years old, they were born after the global US war on terror began, and they do not necessarily buy into the rhetoric of securitization and insecurity that drives this horrific state violence. At least that's my hope. So I think this is a different historical moment than the moment of the 60s that I invoked earlier, and I'm interested to see where it goes.
Thank you, Alex. Before I go to Mandy, I just want to mention a couple questions that came in. One question is about allies in Israel, not just Palestinian citizens of Israel, but Jewish citizens of Israel as well. What is the status of kind of political currents inside Israel? Any of you who can answer that, for those who are not aware of kind of the politics inside Israel, may be useful. Second is a question about intellectual imperialism. After experiencing IR in East Asia, we'd like to ask Usama and the panelists whether there's a predisposition in academia to submission to power due to years of examinations and lack of socialization compared to the rest of the society. So in the ivory tower, are academics, or is academia predisposed to complicity, or the intellectual class perhaps complicity with power? Maybe this is something we can comment on. But Mandy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. One is that to kind of reiterate what Alex was saying, is this issue around, and actually what Osama said, is this issue around what the university has become under neoliberal management. I think that especially in the UK, we're seeing a new generation of students and academics that are learning a very sad but important lesson, that the institutions that they work for and study in are mostly run by a management that won't stand up on issues that are likely to provoke government anger. They want a quiet life. There's all sorts of excuses being used not to hold events about the situation in Israel and Palestine. One is it's a security issue. The other one, it's a complex issue. We're hearing these excuses time and time again. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on was this question about inside Israel. I'm sure that Sonia can answer much better than I, but when I was based there between 2012 and 2020, there was a small Jewish Israeli anti-Zionist left. It's shrinking all the time. One hopes that the events of the last 6 months is provoking more interest in that, but I see them as a very, very small and marginalized section of Israeli Jewish society. If we look at the opinion polls in Israel, something like 75–80% of Jewish Israelis support what is happening in Gaza. We have to take that into account. You know, people like Alex and others, the historians here, have looked at other examples of settler colonial societies where the population that is doing well out of the discrimination and inequality doesn't want to see the end of it. So I think that when we talk about allyship from Jewish Israelis, of course it's important, but it's a very small and marginal group from my experience. I don't know if that's changed in the last 4 or 5 years, Sonia.
Okay. So before I continue with this, I just wanted to say a comment about what's happening in the United States that just came up to me. I did my master's in the United States, my JSD, and I did travel a lot of, many times to the United States. I definitely can see a big change in terms of, mobilizations for Palestine in US campuses. However, there's one point that we should not overlook. Even if we see this change, eventually, on the political level, when US citizens go to vote, foreign policy is not a big concern for them. They vote based on different kind of considerations. So the question is, how do you continue with this shift? Not only to see more mobilization on US campuses, but also to convince people when you go to cast your vote, think of foreign policy as well. Because at the end of the day, what's going to stop the war is a serious, a profound change in US foreign policy. So this is, I think, one of the challenges that US academics should deal with, how to translate this change that we're seeing on campuses into political change in terms of voting trends and making foreign policy something that is really important. Going back to what's happening in Israel, I agree with Mandy that, there is a small group of anti-Zionist, left. But things have changing. I think it's, we see less people who are willing to support this kind of position. To tell you the truth, I was shocked by some of the responses that I saw after, October 7th. Of course, everyone is against the targeting of civilians. We don't need anyone to preach us morality. We know that that is not acceptable. But certain, responses were shocking. Just to mention a fact, some people who were known for their human rights activism actually signed a letter condemning Nadira and sent it to the university. For me, that was absolutely shocking. Of course, you see different kind of people who did not do this shift, but still you see certain kind of resistance that is not obvious. For example, what you would see from prominent human rights defenders or activists or academics who work in human rights in Israel, instead of, like resistance that is, why did South Africa decide to go for genocide? Why not be pragmatic and go for crimes against humanity or war crimes? I mean, come on. They went for this because the facts on the ground supported what they were saying, that Israel is committing genocide. They see these kinds of resistance on the ground. That I don't want to say that I'm horrified that you're using the J word to describe Israel, so I'm going to say it in a different way. So we see this a lot, but at the same time, I have to say that there's still a number of activists and scholars who continue to believe in what they believe in. And we see this in the numbers, very, very small number of Israeli academics that signed petition, for example, like the one that I mentioned for President Biden, asking him to stop selling weapons. And also they have to deal with the consequences of harassment, intimidation. And there was a campaign against them with mentioning their names, their social media, because they signed this. So it's a complicated situation.
Thank you, Sonia. And there was a question about the recording for this video. We will definitely be posting the video as soon as possible, and with, of course, Mother Carmel both disseminating it. We'll be posting it on securityincontext.org, and also visit Mother Carmel or sign up to their mailing list as well. Both of us will be disseminating it as soon as possible. I think it's an important point you raised, Sonia, that may be worth discussing a little bit about foreign policy and this opposition. Certainly true that historically we tend to think in the US that foreign policy is not a major factor in elections, but one of the things we've seen is increasing possibilities and real critiques of Biden government policy, including from people within the administration, that it is actually potentially impacting the Biden administration in terms of like the uncommitted movement that was basically people in the kind of primaries showing that they're uncommitted. But I think it's a good question to pose to the rest of the panel in terms of, from your vantage point, because so what? There's all this opposition. How will actually elites get the message, and actually how will this make a change? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about this.
Yeah, well, what I would say is I mean, I agree with most of what Sonia said, except for the fact on foreign policy. I mean, obviously, the fact is that Israel is, there's a huge support, historically speaking, like Israel has been a domestic issue as much as a foreign policy issue, and yet it's a state that's overseas and a foreign state. So the idea of saying that it's always played a role in U.S. politics and U.S. thinking. The point I think she was making is that those who are advocating for justice in Palestine, are marginal, and they have historically been marginal, but no longer necessarily. Let's see what happens, because a lot of younger people, and question is how many of these people will actually end up voting, but a lot of people understand that there's a relationship between the struggle for social justice, racial justice, environmental justice, and of course justice overseas. And they understand these things, and they're increasingly aware of these things. Whether this changes the elites is a totally different question. That's of course what it comes down to. And it's not that the elites are not aware. They are aware. They just simply, I think this is the question. The cultural elites, the academic elites, the political elites are totally aware of the oppression of the Palestinians. I don't think anyone honestly can say that the Palestinians are not being subjected to unspeakable oppression. The problem is that the vast majority of people are invested in and have invested in this sort of paradigm, which is that Israeli security, Israeli security, Israeli security, Israeli security, and the other paradigm of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism to such a degree that they can't get themselves out of this. And there's, you know what I'm saying, that's the issue that we're facing. So let's see what happens. I can't, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the elections, you know, here or in other Western countries. Let's see. But there is certainly a paradigm shift taking place. What the consequences are, we have to wait and see.
Mandy or Alex, do you want to jump in with some? We're close to kind of finishing the coming to an end of the webinar, and maybe I'll ask you, Mandy and Alex, for some comments and wrap up, and then if Sonia and Osama have any last comments as well. But Mandy, go ahead.
I do think I also agree with Osama. I think there is there will be some impact on the elites of the work that academics, civil society actors, students are doing. We're changing the position of our institutions. That will have a huge impact, particularly if we gain support for BDS. The other thing, though, that we haven't, well, we've touched on a little bit, is the impact of other states' behaviour on our states. So, for example, if you look at the British government, the political elites in the British government started to get very nervous around the case that South Africa took. Very nervous indeed, because once you start using the J word and once you start bringing in international lawyers, that's when governments start to get worried. And that's when you started to get much more discussion in the UK elite system and in the Parliament about British policies, particularly around arms and around funding for UNRWA. That's not to say that they're going to change it overnight, but all of these different pressures build up and build up. So I would like to end on a hopeful note and to say to our Palestinian friends and colleagues, we will continue the struggle in our countries for solidarity. We will continue to tell the truth. We will follow your lead. And at some point, we hope that we manage to break the dams in this country on terms of British policy towards Israel and Palestine.
Just briefly, I would say, to echo something that Sonia said earlier, US academicians, students and faculty and staff at US institutions are also operating on two fronts. One of those is to contest the dehumanization and racism directed towards Palestinians. And so that means reading Palestinian scholars, centering Palestinian voices in our politics. The other front, though, is a politics of divestment at our campuses and a politics of BDS. And that's where we engage not to speak for Palestine or to speak for Gazans, but where we speak against the complicity of our institutions with what is happening. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of wrestling within social movements about who speaks for what. I think that we do need to be careful about who speaks for what for Palestine, right? We don't need we should center Palestinian voices and Palestinian scholars in the field of Palestine studies at this moment, especially. But there's another way we speak, which is in solidarity. And that's where we don't speak as Palestinians, but we speak with Palestinians, and we speak against the complicity of our institutions, and we endorse the politics of BDS, and we ask our institutions to divest, which is what I see students across the United States doing today. Thanks.
Osama, I'll go to you next for a last word.
No, I just want to echo and agree with virtually everything everyone said today. So I thank my colleagues. I think the struggle is going to be continued, and the reality is that once you've lost the intellectual and ethical and moral ground, it is virtually impossible to regain it. And because so much of the support for colonial Zionism has been predicated on the denial and obfuscation of the Palestinians, once that obfuscation has been broken through, you can't really sort of you can try to do it, but it's going to be very difficult to go back to obfuscation. So now it's simply crude intimidation and violence and terror, and that can only work to an extent. But that's where we are right now. Let's see how it plays out.
Thank you, Osama. And I'm gonna ask Sonia to kind of give us the last word as also representing Mad al-Carmel. But before that, I wanted to thank everyone on behalf of Security in Context. Thank everyone for coming. Thank our panelists, Usama, Mandy, and Alex, and really thank Mad al-Carmel first and foremost for all their work and really the crucial advocacy and analysis that they're doing. Please check them out if you don't know them already, and they're really worthy of all the support we can give them. And with that, maybe Sonia, you can take us out here.
Okay, just one final comment. I just wanted to tell my colleagues to thank them for accepting the invitation to participate in this and say, whatever you do there, like your support makes a lot of difference. Solidarity makes a lot of difference. It gives us strength to continue what we're doing. And I want to also, send a message to those who participated, the audience. Like every time you speak up, you're encouraging maybe 1 or 2 or 3 more people to speak up against the injustice, the grave injustice that's being inflicted on Palestinians. So don't underestimate the importance of one single voice. One single voice could encourage, break the silence of 5 or 4 people. So please continue doing what you're doing and stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Bye.